if in fact we did take the premise on that I just mentioned, if we did see the necessity of a kind of inversion where we saw our capacities for learning as if the thing that we really want to help, the mission, if you will, that, as everybody was talking about, was to help somebody's capacities for learning extend, help somebody extend their capacities for learning. If that really was what we were about, then what would that mean? What are our capacities for learning? What capacities for learning are most significant and empowering and most deeply relevant? So I'd like to ask you to take a couple of minutes and find somebody to talk to and think about that. And I'd like to come back and harvest what you think our capacities for learning are, because we've got some more steps to make.
It's a synonym for capacity.
Okay. I mean, even this is interesting, right? You could say ability. You could say, in the raw sense, potential. A potential converted, a potential which has been realized that somebody's participating in. I mean, I hear responses that go from reading, writing, and arithmetic to the somatic experience of uncertainty. I mean, there's a wide range here. And that's what I think we got to be learning about before we can map back to how can we design a curriculum unless we're in touch with what it is we're trying to bring out at that level. Can't do it. What I want to say is that not necessarily what is our range of potential. I agree. I mean, it would be ridiculous to try to identify that. However, what are the capacities? What are the different attributes of our capacity to extend our learning, right? And so in that sense, that's where we have to go, right? And that's what I want to talk about. And I think that there's a way of meeting learners at that level where we can, in fact, through our relationship with them, give them the sense that their ability to extend themselves, extend their capacities is more valuable than what they're learning about. And that if they take that, boom. And if they don't, then we're just piling the stuff on that's encrusting their capacities in the name of helping them learn.
Well, reading what you said back here, looking at your comment that you're becoming aware that you're beginning to drift, and I guess that really gets back at the point that I was thinking of earlier when I mentioned, learning comes in a variety of forms, and even while you're reading, your thought process may shift to something else which is totally alien to what you're reading, and yet that's still learning.
Right. Well, no, yes, it is. And now the question, though, is that if we can participate in that and recognize that this is an authentic movement rather than just a mindless tangent, then we're really learning.
That's right. I guess that's what I'm...
Okay. So that's what, if we can't sense that, then we're kind of coma patients. Yeah. And I want to talk about that.
Right.
I submit that if we don't become capacity-oriented in the way that we approach education, that we're going to damage capacities. If it doesn't pervade our intention to facilitate the capacity for learning, the capacities for learning, and I want to talk more about that, then out of our ignorance and out of the fact that we're not fundamentally oriented towards that, and we're fundamentally oriented to something we think is more important, okay, then we're going to harm them. And we do. If the very fact that we've got so much work to do to understand our capacities, not necessarily just in scientific terms, but in terms of our own observation of our own learning, right? Okay, so we said infinite. There was a question about are they individual, right? And kind of observe, reflect, extend out into the world. I think all those are real helpful. I mean, I don't see how we could talk about capacities in a scientific sense and write about them on the board up here as if they didn't belong to anybody. But in any real sense, the capacities for learning are necessarily somebody's, and therefore necessarily, at least in terms of how they're somebody's extending into them, individual. I don't know that we might not say that there are certain capacities that are generic to human beings, but the actualization or how those capacities manifest would certainly be individual. there's a thought experiment that I do. Part of what caused all this to start to trigger in me, years ago, had to do with this question of capacities. I used to find myself reading along in a book, and perhaps other people here have as well, being very, very interested, real motivated, really into the subject matter, moving along, and then all of a sudden I would be kind of like waking up with the realization that I'd turned a page or two, my eyes had scanned a paragraph or two, and yet I was aware that I did this, but I'd lost the content. I can't remember what I read. Anybody here not have that experience? Well, this happens all the time. My friend Margaret talks about it happening on the freeway when she's driving. and I can identify with that too. It certainly happens, in many different settings. The thing I want to illustrate with this point about kind of falling asleep in the midst of, is that so long as we are in the middle of learning and capable of dropping out like that and drifting away without even being aware that we dropped out, it says something very significant. It says something very significant about how we've learned about our learning. It says that we haven't learned anything about our learning, that it can just drift away from us like this, and we're not even aware of it until we're out of it, coming back to it. Because what I want to get at is that we can talk about capacities from a point of view of, as I said, from the crudest level of reading, writing, and arithmetic, as if there are certain knowledge capacities or skill capacities that extend us. Or we could talk about capacities from a more phenomenological point of view and talk about uncertainty, how the ground of science is the articulation of a good question, and the articulation of a good question is the articulation of somebody's living uncertainty. Right? And we could talk about curiosity or the impulse of creativity. Right? We can talk about all of these different phenomenological, much below conscious in their origin, impulses that are the undercarriage of how we learn. But the simplest access, I think, is that the capacity that we need to regard as having the highest value of all the capacities for learning would be the capacity to participate in extending your capacity for learning. I mean, what could be more important? What could we help somebody learn, than how to become aware of their learning in a way that they could become extending of their capacities for learning? What would be more generally relevant given the conversation we've been having? And if we were going to do that, what would it mean? I mean, I submit that the first thing it would mean is they'd have to become aware when they were falling out of learning. Because if they couldn't do that, then they couldn't be aware of how they could leverage that into something to participate. In other words, if they can mindlessly drop off and fall out of the flow of learning, what forms the basis from which they could participate? And what that means is that they're not connected to or aware of their learning process. This includes critical thinking. I mean, critical thinking would imply doing this if it wasn't just a machine. Right? So what we want to do is to see if we can have a conversation that gets into this. What kind of an environment would be necessary for people, children, to develop the capacity to become aware of their learning, to develop, if you will, a sense for learning, to develop a way to become aware of their uncertainties and curiosities and where they were valuable and where they weren't, to tune an instrument, to learn to trust their own, what I call learning needs. Because I don't think that there's anything that we can do that's more important. Now, that isn't to say that this is more important per se than the knowledge and skills in terms of the necessity of them in the curriculum, given the conversation we were having. But I want to say that the best way, if we were concerned with mathematics or we're concerned with science or we're concerned with any given subject matter, that the best way that we could help somebody become a master in that is to turn that subject matter into an exercise environment in which they first became a master of their learning.